Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, capital markets analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we've got Katrina Gogowski. She's an attorney and angel investor. She's going to be on the line with us to talk about how Americans might be ready to invest in cannabis. So after quite the fall from March until recently, 60% drop. So apparently they're back ready to invest, assuming they have some cash. So Katrina, thanks for being on the line to chat with us.
Morning, Josh.
So the question of Americans' attitudes toward the cannabis industry is one of the core surveys conducted by Go Banking Rates. The survey asked over 800 investors about their thoughts concerning marijuana and whether cannabis stocks could become a part of their nest egg. The results demonstrated that despite people's concerns about the future of legal cannabis industry, about half of Americans have already started making investments or are open to investing in pot stocks down the line. So a couple of the takeaways we're going to talk about is the key findings, and that 49% of investors are open to cannabis stocks. What else would it take for more Americans to invest in cannabis? The Americans see the potential in the industry, and what is the future of cannabis stocks? So starting with the key findings, almost 1 in 10 Americans are already investing in cannabis stocks. About 51% said they had no plans of investing, but those are people that are 65 and older. So nothing new to cannabis, nothing special. When you're older and you have fixed income, you're more conservative. That's just normal business.
Yep, doesn't surprise me at all.
So 2/3 of the people that were surveyed thought that cannabis should be legalized at the federal level, and a whopping 70% of the respondents aged 18 to 34 supported legalization, whereas nearly half, ages 65, were against it. Same thing, very conservative people have their conservative approaches, and that's not anything new.
This doesn't surprise me either. Americans want federal legalization for a variety of reasons. Maybe they live in a state where it's not legal. Maybe they have a medical condition that they feel should be treated. Or maybe they just believe in an open economy, an open market, and think that people are responsible to make their own choices. But half of the respondents 65 and older are against legalization. That doesn't surprise me either. They're the generation that grew up with gateway drugs, just say no, so it doesn't surprise me. But I also think it's interesting, that statistic specifically, because it is the older Americans that are turning to cannabis for medicinal purposes. And they're finding that when you have rheumatoid arthritis, a little bit of anti-inflammatory compounds can do wonders, much more so than a daily dose of aspirin that destroys your liver. So I think it's interesting, some education there.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have an aspirin system. We have an endocannabinoid system, right? So I think once that Nancy Reagan starts becoming more of like a fried egg sandwich at a cafe rather than this impression in people's domes about what your brain is going to do on drugs, that's going to start changing. And I think with legalization, that'll help too, because 1/3 of the people responded said that they would start investing if it were legalized. That's the only thing that they're worried about, is the legality, not the morality.
Yes, we find this repeatedly. As soon as the big banks get into it, then the institutional investors and the people with a retirement nest egg at risk will start playing in the market because there's money to be made. Who doesn't want to make money?
I don't know if this counts as a nest egg, but 27% said they would invest $1,000 or more.
Hey, $1,000 is better than $0, Josh. If you would have invested $1,000 in Amazon in the early 90s, you and I would not be doing this right now.
Right. And at the same time, they're not safe, right? Only 10% view pot stocks as a safe investment. I don't view any equity stock or otherwise derivatives. None of them are safe. You can't go into this market and assume something's safe. And in fact, the word guarantee is illegal to use in the industry. You can't guarantee returns. And so cannabis industry's future appears to be murky. Investors might want to diversify their portfolios. ETFs, I think, are going to be coming up down the road. But this particular segment talks about 49% of investors are open to cannabis stocks or are already investing. And so to break that down, 9% are currently invested, 39% said that they aren't currently invested, but they're open to it. whereas the remaining 51%, I think, are very conservative and said, no way.
There's people that don't invest in technology. They don't invest in medical devices. They don't invest in what they don't know. Uh, I'm not surprised by this statistic at all. And if the author who wrote this is surprised, uh, I'd be shocked.
I'm not advising my mom or anyone who's 65 or older to invest in cannabis either. It's too fast moving, too much speculation. And especially if you look at this last year, there's just been way too much movement. So it's not an investment, it is a gamble right now. There's just not a lot of fundamentals. And so, when people like MedMen are just making extraordinary amounts of money without generating the revenue to back that up, you kind of have to stop, take a look back and say, should I be invested? Should I be telling people about that? And that's each and own individual, right? We're not giving advice here.
First of all, I'm not a stockbroker. I'm an attorney, and I would never advise anybody to do anything. But I do think the older you are, you have to manage your risk no matter what. Just because you think Ford Motor Company is going to come out with the newest, greatest electric vehicle that's going to change America, that's still a risk too. And a lot of this, I didn't read the actual survey questions, but it would be interesting to see how they phrased the questions. They're using words like safe, no investment safe, as you mentioned. Are you likely to do this? Likely based on what? Based on the fact that I have $1,000 in my pocket? Likely that my grandson convinces me? So some of these statistics can be misleading sometimes.
Absolutely. They're always skewed. There is some motivation to get to an answer. Absolutely. This question is posed by this Yahoo Finance article again about, are Americans ready to invest, with this specific segment or question asking, what else would it take for more Americans to invest in cannabis? So we already talked about the change at the federal level would get 35% to vote. Nearly 1 in 5 said they would consider if a financial advisor recommended it. 16% said they might start investing if more cannabis companies went public.
If cannabis companies are allowed to go on the stock exchange, then the SEC gets involved, and now you have regulations that would address some of this safe discussion about actual financials and accountability to their individual shareholders. Again, the United States is so far behind the rest of the world relating to this industry. The fact that we don't have trading on the stock exchange on a broad basis, there are individual companies and there are some funds, but on a broad basis, I think that the common American would say cannabis is illegal, so it's not on the stock market. But that would be one regulatory way to manage some of these wild valuations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, the age 65 and older had 48% say they would never invest in it regardless, and that's pretty traditional. More would invest in cannabis if it was legalized by the federal government. That makes sense. Bob with Incredibles out in Colorado is having his pension, or not his pension, his 401k and his retirement plans forced to liquidate. He's going to have to pay 30% plus in fees. And so he's going through a whole bunch of issues, more than just what people in their bank accounts are dealing with.
For no reason.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be legalized eventually, but for whatever reason, there's a lot of financial firms that are worried about losing their charter or license or whatever, and yet 66% believe that cannabis should be legalized at the federal level. 1 in 5 said that they would invest $100 initially. 16% said that they would invest in between $100 and $500. And so, yeah, they really drilled down and find out what's your overall involvement. That's not a nest egg. That's more of kind of what you would throw down at the craps table.
Yeah. At the beginning of this article, they said they surveyed 800 investors. Where'd they get this list? If you're going to invest $100 to $1,000, that does not sound to me like you are an accredited investor that should be playing in this market in the first place. And if you're a cannabis company, what are you going to do with $100 on your cap table? Um,
Right.
so again, these questions are interesting, Josh.
These articles usually are interesting one way or another, good or bad.
Yep.
And so Americans are seeing potential in the industry. So maybe it was skewed to see what the fear factor was and how to work away around that or navigate to just who is going to invest in the industry to target a specific audience or whatnot. 1/3 of the respondents made sure to note that the uncertainty surrounding the industry, and roughly 1 in 4 identified the negative stigma attached to cannabis as a reason to kind of hold back or wait on the sidelines. What are the impressions of the cannabis industry is that 42% believe that it's growing fast. There's a lot of uncertainty at 34%. 10% believe they're a safe investment. Risky and not worth it is the other 12%, and everything in between.
This is the best statistics that I've seen out of this survey so far, because this explains why. Why people won't invest $100, which is laughable in and of itself, but the industry is growing too fast and it is not highly regulated. And that's number 1 and 2 on the list. How do you pick a brand? If you're a grandma in Oklahoma, how do you know what the brand is? How do you know what all of these complicated extraction processes are? What's CBG?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just education. But this chart in particular does not surprise me. And I'm glad that they actually asked why, because you have to get all the way to less than 20% before you talk about legality and cannabis is bad. So that's a good statistic.
We have to infer a lot of times why people make the purchasing decisions they do, because with data, you just can't tell. And so actually asking the question is phenomenal. I love to know exactly why. And yet my banking experience will tell me that the number one fraud, the financial fraud, is faith-based organizations, religious groups. And I've seen it personally where the last the last 25 years, I've been pushing cannabis and marijuana, and my mom finding it in college and not being happy. And then now she's asking me about CBD when I've been pushing it for 5+ years, more as like a 1-to-1 ratio, but she's not going to try THC even at a 20-to-1 ratio. And yet she came to me because on this faith-based radio show, they've got some CBD. So hopefully there's not a lot of frauds out there. We've already seen with Orange County Real Housewives that the 500 some odd milligrams had trace amounts like 2 maybe. And so when you're following groups and organizations, you really need to do some due diligence and not just take their word for it. Having said that, they do have this group that my mom, I don't know if Jesus made it himself or whatever, but it's got organic, it's full spectrum, and organic by the FDA, full spectrum, all this stuff. So it sounds good. But whether or not it works, I don't know. But I am worried that there's going to be some faith-based scams, just like the real world. It's just a matter of time probably before it happens.
That is highly unfortunate. I encourage all of our listeners to talk to a qualified treatment provider. There are plenty of doctors now that can give you real information. And as far as making an investment or a purchase, just because your spiritual advisor, because your nephew, or because your financial advisor told you to, you should be doing your own research and not just jumping on a bandwagon because this is what Jesus would do, or this is what my nephew would do, or this is what my financial advisor would do. What is the choice for you?
It's really hard because there's not a whole lot of trusted places to go in such a new industry. Whereas even Charlotte's Web wasn't immune to FDA claims. And so that's a solid brand. That is essentially what made cannabis regulated was, in my opinion, the Colorado team, the Stanley brothers, making that claim for children with epilepsy. That is what pushed this whole thing 6, 7, 8 years ago, whenever it was, and really drove the whole process of it all. And so, having said that, the news is going to condemn the the use of claims, but hopefully the products and the brands will survive, those that are good, right? Those that are actually fundamentally sound. But it is just a commodity. And so that's one thing we want to look at with the future of cannabis is it's normal and it's going to have faith-based scams. It's going to have commodity prices crash and companies burn. And, the Schedule 1 companies can't file bankruptcy. And so they're really going to, I don't even know what's going to happen. But it's not going to be pretty. And so what can you do? I guess diversify, look at reducing risk by buying an ETF, an exchange traded fund like a portfolio. And so, systemically, the whole thing could go down and you can't diversify. That's what we saw in 2008, 2009 when everything collapsed, which I believe will happen again. But once there is a little bit of pressure on cannabis and a whole lot of pressure on banking and everything else, cannabis will start to increase as everything else just plummets. And that's because there's an inverse relationship with sin stocks and vices during an economic correction. And so maybe that's the cleanest dirty shirt in the room.
Diversification, and an ETF has people running that ETF that are responsible to the federal government for things like accounting and reporting that a lot of individual investments don't have in the cannabis space. There's very little accountability right now. And so if you're thinking of dipping your toe in the water with $100, ETF.
Yeah. So we've seen from Market Watch that cannabis stocks have ended a 3-day rally. This is like a week or two ago, and the fundamentals seem to be coming back in focus. And yet, if you watch our AI-based algorithm that is based on technical analysis, not fundamentals, with predictive analytics, you're going to see that our index is moving sideways and it has dipped. So people are pulling money out, which is normal. There's some reallocation, there's some profit taking. And so the money kind of came right back in the following week. But we're testing new lows. So we have new support levels and it's hitting a resistance that looked like it could have a breakout, and it's not. It went back down. So I'm not too certain that fundamentals are back in focus yet. I would be very cautious through the end of the year before we see any true bottom. But you're just going to have to come back to the Talking Hedge and find out. So Katrina and I are going to both be in Las Vegas for the MJ BizCon. I'm going to try and tackle her and get her to talk to me about cannabis and the venture capital market that it's buzzing as firms seek to capitalize on the hype. So it's going to be our next topic later in the week, live from Las Vegas. So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I want to thank my guest, Katrina Golgowski, attorney, angel investor in Seattle. Appreciate you being back on the podcast.
Thanks, Josh. See you in Vegas.
See you in Vegas. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out. By the way, if you enjoy the content, please show your support with the cushy gesture of $4.20 a month on the Talking Hedges Patreon page. This will kind of help you spread the word. I've been asked to speak all over the world, from Toronto and Colombia, Spain, Miami, all over, Tokyo. But your support's important to me. I haven't monetized the podcast. I want to be as authentic and transparent as possible. I want to avoid conflicts of interest or even the perception of paid opinions. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or pay me on the Talking Hedges Patreon page, or don't, and I'm out.